Hi, this video is part of a multi-part series where we'll develop secure Spring web app and deploy it to various cloud providers. In the previous session, we've enabled users to sign in via Google and Github. So far, we've been using Spring Security provided sign-in form. The goals of this session is to replace Spring's login form with our own and provide custom look and structure for our application. A little sneak peek of what we'll be implementing. We'll have a public homepage with a list of YouTube videos that contains lessons on how to create this app. We'll be able to log in via our custom form with build 321, which will redirect us to our user page. We could also log out and log in via some of the OAuth providers, let's say GitHub, to showcase, which will display a GitHub image of the logged in user, and will also show that we've joined via GitHub. We'll be using Timelift templating engine to build our web pages. If you've never been exposed to its syntax or need a refresher on what it is, I've created up to speed with Timelift video you can check out. To help stylize our pages, I'll be using Semantic UI CSS framework. It's an alternative to Bootstrap CSS if you used that before, with rich set of components and easy to understand semantic classes. Development on the original Semantic UI framework stopped, so community created a fork. F in Semantic is for fork, in case you were wondering. Let's recap current functionality of our application. We have two hard-coded users, Bill and Bob, which we can use to sign in. Bill 321. We can also sign in via GitHub and via Google. In this browser session, I've already logged into Gmail and GitHub, so that's the reason why I wasn't presented with their sign-in screen and instead was directly redirected to our app. I've signed out of GitHub, and to remind you, the authentication flow in that case is that you're first presented with the sign-in screen from GitHub, where you sign in and then you are being redirected to the application. Currently, all our app requires authentication. Instead, what I'd like to have is homepage accessible to everyone so that users have an idea what the site is about and the ability to sign in if they desire to do so. In order to make certain pages public, we'll need to customize our HTTP request configuration. HTTP request customization always has the pattern of which security rules should be applied to which page. So in our case, we'll say that request matchers of /, which is our home page, should have a permit all rule applied. If we go to localhost 8080 now, we are greeted with a welcome page. And if we hit some other page, we are redirected to the login page. When we log in, we get 404 because the page doesn't exist. But notice that the Spring redirected us to the page we requested after we successfully logged in. This is called request caching, and it's the behavior I think users normally expect. We have a plain looking home page. Let's create richer user experience, and more generally, let's create skeleton for how all our pages should look like, with the top menu, app title and content underneath. In our Java application, we'll create fragments subdirectory in our templates directory, so we provide structure for application. First, we'll create skeleton fragment, which will be used by every other page in application. We'll name our fragment layout, so data th fragment. And we'll go to Semantic UI site to getting started section and copy the JavaScript and CSS file required for us to use the Semantic UI framework. We'll paste it in the head section. We want to have top menu in our layout, so we'll need a parameter for active menu, and we'll also need a parameter for content. We'll include all our content in the container class. So we'll need top menu here, which we'll create next, and this will be content. Content will be in a div, let's say just div, and we'll insert the content that is being passed in our fragment as a parameter. So we'll reference it by $content. Let's create our menu fragment. So we'll create HTML file, call it menu. Actually, we don't need this. I've went to Fomantic UI site to their layouts page and taken the source from this layout as my inspiration and adjusted it to fit our needs. So I'll paste it in and I'll call this as data.th fragment top menu. I'll take that fragment and include it in our skeleton with div. We'll just replace all this div with the content of the fragment. And the fragment is in, so we need to reference the fragment by tilde. It's in fragments, menu, top menu. Let's go to our index page and try to use our layout fragment. First, we'll name actually this div. We'll give it ID of home content, and we'll replace our all HTML with the fragment. So data.th replace tilde curly braces, it's in fragments skeleton file, and the fragment name is layout. We'll need to provide two parameters. One is for active menu, we'll say home, and the content will be in the current file. We can say this, but we don't need to. We can just say double quotes, and we reference the content because it's the ID. We'll use the hash as in CSS selector home content. I've noticed I've copied wrong CSS and scripts for Fomantic, the one that assumes you have distributions in your local server environment. So let's go to the getting started and copy the right one, the one from CDN provider, and we'll replace this one. I think that should be enough. Let's restart our app and see how the index page looks now. If we hit our localhost 8080, there we have a nice looking skeleton. Since we have a YouTube series on how to build this app, I'd like a welcome page to display those in a list with thumbnails. We'll then have a meta app that describes on how to build itself. For an inspiration for a list, we'll use Fomantic UI card components. I'll copy the source from one of these examples and adjust it for our own style. In our application, I'll replace the current home page index.html with the content of the cards. I'll need 3 images for the thumbnails of the cards, which I've placed in the static images directory. If we now save and restart and go to our application and refresh, we'll see our cards, but the images are not being displayed. If we open our network tab and try to refresh, we'll see our images are getting 302 redirects. And if we open it to see the details, we'll see that they are being redirected to localhost /login. So it means that our authentication rules are blocking the images from being displayed. We'll need to go back to our security configuration and permit access to everyone on our images subdirectory. We'll do that by using the double asterisk wildcard. If we restart our app now and go to our page and refresh, and voila, there are our thumbnail images. I'd like to change the background color of our application, so we'll go back to our IntelliJ, and in the static folder of our resources directory we'll create app CSS file. We'll paste in the rule for background color. Now we need to include the reference to this file in our skeleton so it can be used by our application. This time we can't use absolute href because it's the file in our application, so in order for Timelift to be able to find it, we'll need to use the @ reference. It's app CSS. And the same rule applies as for images. Application won't let app CSS be seen by anyone until we include a rule that enables that, and we'll say any file that ends with CSS, and we might as well include JavaScript files, even though we don't have any right now. And if we restart and refresh our app, we should see a background color change. Let's open one of the thumbnails in a new tab, go back to our application, clear the logs, and refresh. Since we have tracing enabled for our security package, we'll see that each of the security filters is being run, even though this is a static resource and there's really no need for that. Spring Security had different way to address the issue of static resources with different versions of the framework, so take the approach I'm about to show you with a grain of salt. We'll create another security filter chain that will be run only for our static resources. And so we'll create a bean of security filter chain type, we'll call it resources, and we'll take HTTP security, HTTP. The way we know it will be run, first we'll give it an order of 0. And then for HTTP, we'll return build. We need to add exception to the method signature, and the way we know it will be run only for our static resources, we'll apply security matcher. Security matcher is like a marker that tells Spring for which resources should this filter chain run. Next we need to supply our configuration for this matcher. So let's just close the window. First we'll authorize all HTTP requests, same as our own main filter chain will say that any request is permitted because these are static resources, but we can disable certain things. First, security context, we don't need that, so we'll say that context is disabled. We also don't need session management, so also customizer disable. And also what we don't need is request caching, so we'll disable that one as well. And in our make configuration we don't need the part for our resources, so we'll remove it. We can use method reference in these disable methods, although this makes them even longer. Just to remind you, request caching is saving URL when user tries to access when unauthenticated, then redirecting user back to login form, and if authentication is successful, redirecting user back to the initial URL he wanted to access. This pattern of using multiple security filter chains for different resources is not only useful for static resources. Consider that you could have a web app like we do that uses one type of authentication, but also a REST API in the same app that uses different type of authentication. Using different security filter chains is an elegant way to separate those configurations. Let's restart our app and see what filters do we get now when we try to access our image. So let's clear our logs, go to our image, refresh, and you see that this time only 8 filters have been run instead of the 16 in the previous run. I'll have to ignore IntelliJ recommendation to replace this with method reference. I don't think we need to know what's the configurer name. Just plain disable is, I think, way more clear to our intentions of what we're trying to do. So return disable. Let's work on our menu next. So we'll go to the menu HTML, and the first thing we'll need to do is put hrefs. So data.th href references to link to certain pages in our application. Home will link to slash. User will link to user. The page doesn't exist yet, but we'll create it shortly. Our login will go to login, and our sign up button will be disabled for now because we haven't created any page for it yet. Now the user tab should only be displayed if the user is logged in, so we'll go with the time-lived security extension. I'll say security authorize. Will display this tab only if the user is authenticated. So only if is authenticated. If user is not authenticated, then we'll need to show the login button. Same for sign up. So only if not authenticated. And we'll also need to have a logout button that will show only if the user is authenticated, so logout. And this will go to logout. If only I could spell. And if we restart our application and go to our web page, we see home tab and login button when we are not logged in. If we log in with, let's say, Bill 321, we'll see our user tab and our logout button. So if we log out, we are redirected to the login page, and we can log in with Bob 1234. And again, we are redirected to the home page with the user tab and a logout button. Another thing we need to do with our menu is activate the home tab when the home page is present and the user tab when the user page is present. We'll do that with time-lived class append feature, class append. So we'll say, and we don't have the parameter for active menu, so we'll input it, and we'll say that if active menu equals to home, then we'll append the class of active, otherwise we'll append an empty class. And similarly for the user tab, if active menu equals user, we'll append the active class, otherwise we'll leave the empty class. And we need to go to our skeleton, and in our top menu call, we'll pass in the active menu we got from the layout. So we'll say active menu. and we pass the value in our indexed HTML. When we call the skeleton menu, we pass the value home. So when we are on the home page, the home menu should be active. So let's restart, and we shouldn't see any change now, so let's just test that the home menu is still active. Our user tab doesn't lead to anywhere right now, so let's go back to our application and create our app user controller to show the user page. It will be a controller, and it will have request mapping of user. And for the get method, for the get mapping, we'll just return user. So show user info, return, and let's place HTML related to user to app user subdirectory user HTML. So we'll go to our templates and create subdirectory app user, and in there we'll create an HTML user. I've used Semantic UI site for inspiration and created HTML in advance, so you don't have to see me type. And the only thing we need to do is replace this whole HTML with our layout fragment. So it's in fragments, skeleton page, skeleton layout fragment. This time for active menu we'll pass user, and for the content we'll pass the content in this page, which is, so this page, user segment ID. So we can use the CSS selector hash user segment. And this should be enough. Let's test our page out. If we refresh, we can try to log in with Bill 123, sorry, Bill 321. And we have our user tab and our home tab. If we click our user tab becomes active. We can switch back and forth. And here I've prepared a part where we can see the user info, and a part where the user will be able to change its password. Let's talk about the way we can get hold of the user info in our app user controller. One way is to use Java's notation of principal, which only has the get name method, so it's not enough for us. Another way is to use authentication, Spring's authentication object, which is fine, but it has by default authentication methods, so we would need to cast it to our app user in order to access all the fields, all the custom fields for our app user. Another way you could get a hold of authentication is by using security context holder get context get authentication, but you have the same issue and the need to cast to app user. So the way I'd recommend instead is by using annotation authenticated principal, and it will directly give you the app user that's being authenticated, which then you can use the model, Spring's model. So make sure you import the Spring UI framework model, and you can add the app user attribute to the model for your web page to use. So let's go to our users HTML and use the app user fields. We'll go to our part where the username is displayed. We'll say data th text is app user username, the way the user has been joined or signed in will note in the span tab will say data th text. So that's provider, user provider. We want to display an image of the user if the user has an image. So let's go with, so image will display in case the image field is populated, so we'll use the data th if. So if app user image URL is populated, then we'll display the field and we'll display it in the source. And we can say unless, actually, okay, let's do this. Unless I've prepared actually a square image as a replacement, and for source we'll say that it's in images, so images square, what's the name, square image png. Let's save, let's restart, and we'll go to our page, refresh, log in with Bill 321, and we see our dummy image, a username, and join via app. If we log out, log in with GitHub, we see our username from GitHub, joined via GitHub, and the GitHub image. And if we log in with Google, we see that we joined via Google, Gmail, and the same image, just lower resolution. So cool, everything works. Let's go back to our app, to our user controller, and we want to have access to the user, to the app user, in all methods in this controller. So far we only have one, so instead of doing this in every method, what we can do is place model attributes at the root of the controller, say that it returns an app user, receive authenticated principal there, and just pass it to all methods in this controller. When we've done that, we no longer need this part. It will be present via this method. So if we restart and go back to our page, refresh, log in via Bill 321, and everything works as before. Let's customize our login page next. Fomantic UI under layouts has a couple of examples of starter pages, and I've used one of those for login form to create something that would fit our need. Let's go to our app. We'll create a new HTML under app user, call it login, and we'll paste our code in there. And I've already included the login fragment, which will repeat the similar procedure as with previous pages. We'll replace skeleton fragment with our own content. So replace the fragment skeleton layout. For login, the user won't have user page visible, so we need to activate the home page, and for content we'll pass in the login fragment. So in this page and login fragment. Next we'll need to go to our security configuration and customize our form login. It will no longer be with defaults, but we'll need to provide a login page of our own. So login page, and it needs to be on /login, and we'll go to our home controller and provide a get mapping for login page. It needs to be, so login. Our login page is under app user login. If we restart our app now and go to our home page, try to refresh, we see we get only the OAuth2 login. So we need to go to our security configuration and say in our OAuth2 customizer that we'll use the login page of login there as well. And if we restart again and refresh, this time we'll see the message that the page isn't redirecting properly. And the reason is that login is no longer permitted to all. So we'll need to add it to our request matches. And then if we restart again, hopefully this time, third time the charm. Refresh, and there we have it, our login page. Our page for login isn't set up properly yet, so we'll need to do that next. We'll go to our login HTML. First we'll need to find the form and provide an action to login. And there's our large form, so we'll say data th action. And usually the action is at /login and the method is post. You can change the, if you want, you can change the action. Let's say we'll say authenticate. And in our security configuration, then in our customizer, we'll need to say that login processing URL is authenticate. We can also customize username and passwords field here. So we can say that username parameter is called user. Let's say password parameter is called pass. And then in our form, we'll need to replace the username with user and the password parameter with pass. That should be it for our form. Let's restart. That should be enough for us to log in. So let's go back to our page, refresh. Let's try Bill 321, and there we have it. We customize our form to enable us to log in via our hard-coded users, but we also need to customize the Google and GitHub links. So we'll find sign in via Google and add data href attributes there, and the default URL is always the OAuth2 authorization and then the name of the provider. We can use similar thing for our GitHub. And we'll restart and refresh our app. And if we try to log in, let's say via Google, this works, but it seems our logout button is now broken. We'll fix that next. Our logout button needs to post to logout, so we'll go to our menu HTML where the button is placed, and we see it's currently just a plain href. So what we'll do is we'll create a form with the data th action of /logout, and the method needs to be post. Now, if we placed the button inside the form as an input, it would mess up our button sizes. So what instead we'll do, we'll just leave the button where it is, and instead of href, we'll use JavaScript to post to the bottom form. So for that, we'll give our form an ID of logout form. And the way you post and the way basically you provide a click handler in Timeleaf is you say data th attribute equals on click, and this will be, I'll just write in first and then I'll explain later. It will be a jQuery that needs to find our login form, our logout form, sorry. Logout form, and it needs to submit to it. That should be it. Let me try to explain this funky syntax. Data th attribute is the way you can provide an on-click handler, and because we don't want this expression to be interpolated by Timeleaf, we placed it between the pipe symbols. It will stay as is. And this $, it's not the $sign that Timeleaf usually uses to interpolate variables. This is the jQuery's JavaScript library $, and the function call takes in a CSS selector as a parameter, so it will search an ID of logout form, find our form, and submit to it. And we've included the jQuery as a JavaScript library because Fomantic UI demands it. So in our skeleton, we'll see that one of the scripts that's included is jQuery. Okay, I hope that made it a little bit clearer. There's another important point to mention, and that's that Spring Security by default includes CSRF, cross-site request forgery protection for you, and Timeleaf includes the CSRF hidden input by default as soon as you use one of its attributes, like we've used data th action here. This is also the reason why you don't want to post directly with jQuery with jQuery post method, because you would have to include CSRF tokens. It's much easier just to create a form and submit to a form. You'll have the CSRF token included that way, and you don't have to do anything. Let's restart our app to explain what I'm talking about. So if we refresh and go to our login form and inspect it, we'll see that it includes the hidden CSRF token. So if we, let's say, sign in via GitHub, we'll have our logout button there. If we inspect and find our logout form, we have an action of logout, and in there we see it already includes the CSRF token. So if you log out now, it works, and we can sign in via Google, click and log out, and it works, and sign in via Bill 321, and this works as well. Nice. Next, what we'd like to customize is where is the user taken after successful login or logout. Let's do login first. We can customize that by providing default success URL. And currently it's the home page. But let's say we want to redirect the user to the user page so he'll be able to see his info. Default success URL method has two signatures. And the second argument, Boolean always use, is related to request caching. In other words, what page did the user originally wanted to see before logging in? If we set this parameter to true, user would always be redirected to user page, and in our case we don't want that. Behavior most users are accustomed to is to be redirected to their original page. Our logout procedure currently redirects to the login page. And let's say we instead want the user to be redirected to the home page. And we have a login button there if he wants to log in again. So we'll customize the logout with logout success URL. We'll set it this to slash. You may remember that Spring Security default logout page includes request parameters $logout and then displays a little "you have been logged out" message on the login screen. We'd like to provide similar functionality in our app. We'll do that by not redirecting directly to home page, but also including request parameter logout. And next we'll need to go to our home controller and provide a request parameter logout. It will be a Boolean, and when we visit our home page, usually we don't have this parameter, so we'll need to say that its name is logout and that it's not required, and default value should be true. The reason why we included the default value is because request parameters are key value pairs. So the correct syntax would have to be $logout equals true. Default value provides us a way to use shorter, concise syntax. The last thing we are required to do is go to our index page and display some message when the user logs out. So we'll use div, let's say URMessage. And we'll only display this message if logout parameter is present, and you can get a hold of the parameter by using param. So if logout is present, we'll display a paragraph of "you have been successfully logged out." Let's restart our app and test it out. So if we refresh and if we log in with, let's say, Bill 321, we are redirected to the users page. If we log out, we are redirected to the home page and the message is displayed. If we log in with Google, we are redirected to the home page. And the reason is we customize the default success URL for form login. We need to do the same for Auth2 login. So we'll say default success URL is user. Let's restart. Refresh. Login, this time via GitHub. And we are redirected to the users page. Let's check out tests that we currently have for our home controller. We have a test that authenticated user can display home page and that anonymous user is not allowed to see home page. And we've made our home page visible to everyone, so this test should no longer be valid. So let's comment that out. Let's create instead a new test that anonymous user can see home page. So anonymous user is allowed to visit home page, if I could type. And we'll say mock MVC perform get on the home page, and we expect that status is okay. We need to add exception, and let's run the test in our home controller class. Now what we see is that our anonymous users is allowed to visit home page. Test failed. We see we got 302 redirect instead of expected 200. The reason that test fails lies in the fact that we used web MVC test annotation, which includes controllers by default, and other configuration classes like ours for Spring Security. Since no configuration for security was found, the default one was again used that secures everything by default, leaving our home page inaccessible to anonymous users. We want to use our Spring Security configuration to test accessibility of URL paths, But we don't want to rely on our hard-coded users Bob and Bill, or any production user for that matter. Instead, we'd like to provide users only for test environments. We'll do that by creating our own test security configuration. So it will be a class, and it will be a test configuration. Now it needs to import our Spring Security, no, not Spring Security configuration class. And our security configuration expects a couple of beans. First bean is the default auth2 user service. So auth2 user service of oidc user request oidc user. Instead of providing our handler that we've used to map users to our app user, we'll just return the default oidc user service. Similarly for auth2 user service that processes auth2 user request and gives back auth2 users. So again, we'll return default auth2 user service. And the third thing we need to provide is user detail service, which will give us our test users. So test users, and we'll return in memory user details manager, and let's call him test users. And for our test users, we'll create user that has, let's say, username of test and password the same, test, and it will have no authorities, so empty list. Next, we'll import our test security configuration into our home controller test, and we'll run our test again. We expect that our real security configuration now kicks in, and it does, and we are allowed to visit our home page for every user, not just the authenticated one. Let's discuss how we test for auth2 and oidc sign-in. That would require some kind of grant flow with an authorization server. Certainly this would be a daunting task, which is why Spring Security ships with support for removing the boilerplate. Instead of going through real authorization flow, we can use configured auth2 users as though we were logged in. Let's create another home controller test, this time without our test security configuration, so the default Spring configuration kicks in that secures everything. So we'll say home controller test 2. This is a web MVC test, and we'll need to auto wire mock MVC as before, and we'll test that oidc user can visit home page, and we'll say mock MVC perform get, we need to add exception to medic signature, and we expect that status is okay. The way we log in the way we say we are logged in with oidc user, we use with and we use oidc login. Now this tells Spring that we should log in, we should simulate login with oidc user that has oidc token with sub of user and has no claims and has the scope of read authority. And we see our test passes. We can create a similar test method for our auth2 users. And this time, instead of oidc login, we'll use auth2 login. And we can show how to provide a custom user if you need to. So we'll say auth2 user is new default auth2 user, and we'll say that auth2 login will be done with auth2 user, this one we've provided. Now we can create the user by providing the constructor. We need to provide granted authorities, so let's do some. We'll use authority utils, create authority list, and we'll provide, let's say, authority of scope user read. And next we'll need to provide attributes, map of attributes. So we'll do collections, singleton map. We can say username, and the value will be test, let's say. And next we need to provide name attribute key, so this needs to match this. So we'll say username. And this should be enough. Let's try to run our test. And it passes as well. This is useful if you need to test for certain oidc or auth2 user attributes. This is the way you could customize it and test it in your page. You may find it strange that I've included oidc and auth2 user again on home controller test when we have our app user controller. The reason is our test configuration contains just a common user, so our app controller user that has common attributes would cause the test to fail. And I won't bother you here. I just wanted to show you how the auth2 user login functionality and oidc login functionality is used, and I'll add the app controller test offline. It will be present in the final code. This concludes our session where we showed how to customize Spring Web App's login experience. In the next session, we'll need to implement sign-in form and finally replace our hard-coded Bob and Bill users. We'll also implement password reset form, and that will give us the opportunity to discuss form handling and validation in Spring. Until then, happy coding!